57 BC. A Roman valley in Gaul becomes a killing ground when 70,000 screaming warriors surround 5,000 legionnaires building camp. No walls, no reinforcements, no escape. The Nervi tribe has planned this ambush for months, watching Rome's greatest general make his first catastrophic mistake. In 30 minutes, half the legion is dead. In an hour, Rome's conquest of Gaul will be over. But one centurion refuses to die quietly. What happens next defies every rule of ancient warfare and changes history forever. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. 5,000 Roman legionnaires marched along the banks of the Sabes River, their armor clanking in rhythm, their minds already on the evening meal. They'd been marching through Gaul for months, and every tribe they'd encountered had either surrendered or been crushed. This would be no different. Julius Caesar rode near the front of the column, confident as always. His scouts had reported the area clear. No enemy forces within miles. The Nervi tribe, the fiercest warriors in all of Gaul, were supposedly camped far to the north. Time to build camp. The order went down the line. Thousands of soldiers dropped their packs and began the familiar work. Digging trenches, hauling timber, marking out streets. It was mechanical, practiced. They'd done this hundreds of times. The legionnaires removed their armor. Too hot for digging, they stacked their weapons in neat piles. Swords, javelins, shields. Everything organized, everything proper. Roman efficiency at its finest. Some men waded into the river to fill water skins. Others gathered wood from the tree line. A few joked about what kind of wine they'd find in the next town. The war was nearly won. Gaul would be Rome's by winter. Nobody noticed the forest moving. Across the river, hidden in the thick woods, 70,000 Nervi warriors crouched in absolute silence. They'd been there for hours, watching, waiting. Their bodies painted blue and black, their long swords ready, their eyes fixed on the exposed Romans below. They'd planned this for months. Tracked Caesar's movements, learned his patterns, studied his arrogance. They knew he'd make camp here. They knew he'd let his guard down. And they were right. The Nervi chief raised his hand. 70,000 warriors tensed. Some were teenagers, fighting their first battle. Others were gray-haired veterans who'd killed more men than they could count. All of them understood what came next. This was the moment. Rome had conquered tribe after tribe, burning villages, enslaving families, claiming land that wasn't theirs. The Nervi had watched it all happen. They'd seen proud peoples bend the knee, accept Roman wine and Roman chains. Not them. Never them. The chief's hand dropped. The forest exploded. 70,000 screaming warriors burst from the trees, a wall of fury and iron racing toward the river. They covered 200 yards in seconds, their war cries shaking the earth, their faces twisted with rage and purpose. The Romans looked up from their digging. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. 5,000 men, half-dressed, weaponless, scattered across an open field, staring at an army that outnumbered them 14-1. Then the Nervi hit the water, and the killing began. Men ran for their weapons. Officers shouted orders that nobody could hear. Soldiers grabbed whatever was closest, a shovel, a stake, anything. Some made it to their swords. Most didn't. The first Romans died before they could scream. Later, historians would ask how Rome conquered the world. The answer was simple. Discipline, organization, the legion. 57 years before the birth of Christ, Rome was unstoppable. An empire that had crushed Carthage, defeated Macedon, and dominated the Mediterranean. Their secret wasn't magic or divine favor. It was system. The Roman legion was a machine. 6,000 men organized into 10 cohorts. Each cohort divided into 6 centuries. Each century commanded by a centurion, a professional soldier who'd earned his position through blood and competence. These weren't nobles playing at war. They were killers who'd been doing this for decades. Every legionnaire trained for months before seeing combat. They learned to march 20 miles in 5 hours, carrying 60 pounds of gear. They drilled with wooden swords until their arms went numb. They practiced formations until they could form testudo, the turtle, in their sleep. They weren't just soldiers. They were engineers, builders, and siege experts. A legion could construct a fortified camp for 6,000 men in 4 hours. They could build bridges across rivers, siege towers against walls, roads through mountains. And they won. Constantly. By the time Caesar invaded Gaul, Rome had been expanding for centuries. They'd developed tactics that made them nearly unbeatable. The pilum, their javelin, was designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw it back. The gladius, their short sword, was perfect for close quarters stabbing in tight formations. But more than weapons, more than tactics, it was mindset that made them dominant. Roman soldiers believed they were superior to every other fighting force on earth. They'd proven it in battle after battle. Gauls might be brave, but they were disorganized. Germans might be fierce, but they lacked discipline. Greeks might be clever, but they'd already been conquered. Rome won because Rome expected to win. Julius Caesar embodied this confidence, brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. He'd come to Gaul 3 years earlier with orders to secure the northern frontier. Instead, he'd decided to conquer the entire region. It was working. Tribe after tribe submitted. Those who resisted were destroyed. Caesar's dispatches back to Rome described victories so complete, so overwhelming, that the Senate declared 20-day festivals in his honor. He was building more than an empire. He was building a legend. The legions followed him because he won. Simple as that. Soldiers don't care about politics or philosophy. They care about surviving the next battle and sharing in the plunder afterward. Caesar delivered both. His officers were experienced, his logistics were solid, and his strategic sense was usually impeccable. He knew when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to make an example of someone. Usually. But confidence becomes arrogance when you stop respecting your enemy. And by the summer of 57 BC, Caesar had stopped respecting the Gauls entirely. He'd heard about the Nervi, everyone had. They were supposedly the most warlike tribe in the region. They rejected Roman merchants, Roman wine, Roman culture. They believed luxury made men weak, so they lived like their ancestors, hard and brutal. Caesar wasn't worried. Barbarians were barbarians. Brave, sure. Tough, absolutely. But undisciplined, predictable. And Rome had beaten them all. The Nervi were different, and they knew it. While other Gallic tribes wore colorful tunics and traded with Rome, the Nervi wrapped themselves in animal skins and sharpened their swords. They didn't want Roman roads or Roman peace. They wanted to be left alone. Their territory stretched across what would one day be called Belgium. Dense forests, winding rivers, and hills that made farming difficult. It was land that bred hard people. You hunted or you starved. You fought or you died. Children learned to use weapons before they could read, because there was no reading, no writing, no records, no soft merchant class counting coins. Just warriors and the families who supported them. The Nervi had watched Rome's conquest of Gaul with growing alarm. Tribe after tribe had fallen, the Helvetii crushed in one decisive battle, the Belgi, their cousins, scattered and subjugated. Everywhere Rome marched, freedom died. The other tribes had made the same mistake. They'd fought Rome individually, trusting in their courage and their gods. They'd charged into disciplined Roman formations and been slaughtered. The Nervi decided to be smarter. Their chief, whose name Caesar never bothered to record, understood what most Gauls didn't. Rome couldn't be beaten with courage alone. You needed surprise, terrain, and timing. You needed to catch them vulnerable. So the Nervi prepared. For months, they tracked Caesar's movements. They sent scouts disguised as traders, refugees, and farmers. They learned everything about how Romans made camp, how they marched, how they thought. They discovered Caesar's weakness, his overconfidence. The Roman general was winning so easily that he'd become predictable. He marched with his legions spread out over miles for easier supply. He built camp in the open, trusting his sentries to give warning of any attack. He assumed Gallic tribes would fight the way they always fought, head-on and stupid. The Nervii planned something different. They chose the ambush site carefully. The Sabis River, called the Sambre in later centuries. It had forests on both sides, thick enough to hide an army. The river itself was shallow, easy to cross quickly, and the north bank had a gentle slope perfect for a Roman camp. Caesar would see that slope and order his men to build there. The Nervi were certain of it. They moved 70,000 warriors into position days before Caesar arrived. 70,000 men, silent in the woods, eating cold food and sleeping in shifts. No fires, no noise, no movement that might give them away. Other tribes thought the Nervi were crazy. You don't hide from Romans, you fight them. That's what warriors do. But the Nervi weren't interested in a fair fight. They were interested in survival. And survival meant doing what no Gallic tribe had done before. They assembled farmers and craftsmen alongside professional warriors. Old men who could barely walk stood next to teenagers experiencing their first battle. This wasn't just an army. This was an entire people. Everyone who could hold a weapon, united behind one desperate plan. Kill Caesar. Destroy his legions. Make Rome bleed so badly they'd think twice before conquering anyone else. It was ambitious. It was brutal. And it almost worked. Caesar made mistakes. Not many, and never the same one twice. But on that summer day along the Sabis River, he made a mistake that should have ended his career, his conquest, and possibly his life. He split his forces. 6 legions marched with him toward Nervi territory. Standard procedure dictated they stay close together, within mutual support distance. If one legion got hit, the others could respond within minutes. Caesar decided he didn't need to be careful. He sent 2 legions ahead with his second-in-command, Titus Labienus, to secure a river crossing miles away. That left 4 legions with him, spread out over several miles of road for easier marching and foraging. His scouts reported no enemy activity. The Nervi were supposedly days away, camped in their villages, probably debating whether to surrender or run. Some local Gauls had even told Caesar the Nervi were terrified, that they'd never stand against Rome. Caesar believed them. He wanted to believe them. He'd been campaigning for 3 years straight. He was tired, his men were tired, and the politics back in Rome were getting complicated. He needed this campaign finished. A quick submission from the Nervi, maybe one small battle to make an example, then home for the winter. Easy. His officers said nothing. You didn't question Caesar, not after the victories he delivered. If the general said it was safe to spread out, then it was safe. He was Julius Caesar. He didn't make mistakes. The column reached the Sabis River around midday. The sun was high, the temperature brutal. Men were exhausted from marching in full gear through summer heat. Caesar surveyed the terrain and smiled. Perfect. The north bank had a clear, gentle slope, ideal for a camp. The river provided fresh water. The forest, on the far side, would supply timber. He gave the order. Build camp here. Standard fortifications, standard layout. 6 cohorts would do the construction work, while the others secured the perimeter and foraged for supplies. The Legionnaires got to work. They'd done this so many times. It was routine, automatic. Drop the pack, grab the tools, start digging. Some men removed their armor immediately. Heavy plates and chainmail in summer heat was torture. Others at least loosened their straps. Weapons went into organized piles. Swords here, javelins there, shields stacked against each other. Everything neat, everything proper. Roman order imposed on the wilderness. Nobody bothered with defensive positions. Why would they? The scouts had reported no enemies. The cavalry was patrolling. The camp would be fortified within hours. Just another day in Gaul. Just another camp in a long, successful campaign. Caesar walked among his men, confident and relaxed. He was already thinking about his dispatch to Rome, how he'd describe the submission of the Nervi, how the Senate would react. Across the river, hidden in shadows, 70,000 warriors watched and waited. The Romans kept working, digging, hauling, building, completely exposed, completely vulnerable, completely unaware they were standing in a killing ground. The Nervi chief watched Caesar himself walk past, close enough that a good archer could have ended everything right there. Not yet. Wait for the signal. Let them get more disorganized, more spread out, more comfortable. Wait until they can't possibly respond in time. Then kill them all. 30 minutes changed everything. That's how long it took from the first war cry to complete catastrophe. Half an hour to go from confident Roman efficiency to desperate, dying chaos. The Nervi came out of the forest like a flood. 70,000 warriors moving as one, screaming, their weapons high, their faces twisted with fury. They hit the shallow river at full sprint and barely slowed. Water exploded around them. The sound of their charge was like thunder. The Romans looked up from their digging. For one terrible second, time seemed to stop. Men stood frozen, shovels in hand, staring at the wall of enemies racing toward them. Some tried to process what they were seeing. An ambush, here, now, impossible. Then survival instinct kicked in, and everyone ran. But ran where? Their armor was off. Their weapons were stacked 50 yards away. The camp wasn't fortified. There were no walls, no gates, no defensive positions. Just open ground and 70,000 enemies. The Nervi crashed into the first Romans before they'd taken 10 steps. Men were cut down mid-stride, swords slicing through exposed backs, spears punching through ribs. Legionnaires who'd survived a dozen battles died in seconds, killed before they could even turn around. The organized chaos of camp construction became just chaos. Officers tried to shout orders, but nobody could hear over the screaming. Centurions attempted to form defensive lines with whoever was nearest, but there was no time. The Nervi were everywhere, moving too fast, hitting too hard. Some Romans reached their weapons. These were the lucky ones. They grabbed swords and shields, formed small knots of resistance, tried to hold. But they were isolated, surrounded, outnumbered 20-1. Others fought with whatever they could grab: shovels, tent stakes, rocks. One legionnaire later reported killing a Nervi warrior with a hammer meant for driving posts. Another strangled an enemy with his bare hands. It didn't matter. There were too many. The Nervi had planned perfectly. They hit the weakest point of the Roman line, the 7th Legion, which was spread out furthest. These men never had a chance. They died in the first 5 minutes, overwhelmed and butchered. The 9th Legion tried to form up nearby. Their commander, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, managed to get maybe 200 men into something resembling a formation. It lasted 30 seconds. The nervi swarmed them. Sabinus went down with a spear through his throat. His men broke and ran for the river. Most didn't make it. Blood turned the grass slick. Bodies piled up so thick they became obstacles. Wounded men crawled, trying to reach safety that didn't exist. The air filled with screams, war cries, the clash of metal on metal, and the wet sounds of swords finding flesh. In 30 minutes, over 1,000 Romans were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded, many mortally. 3 of Caesar's 6 cohorts were combat ineffective. The greatest military machine in the world was being destroyed by tribal warriors who shouldn't have stood a chance. And the nervi weren't even close to done. In every battle, there's a man who refuses to accept defeat. A soldier who looks at impossible odds and decides they don't matter. For Rome, that day, that man was Centurion Publius Sextius Baculus. He was 53 years old, which was ancient for a combat soldier. He'd served in the legions for 35 years. He'd fought in Spain, Greece, Africa, and now Gaul. His body was a map of violence, scars layered on scars, old wounds that ached in cold weather. He should have retired years ago, gone home to Italy, bought a farm, spent his final years in peace. But Baculus didn't know how to do peace. Fighting was what he did. Fighting was who he was. When the nervi attacked, Baculus was with the 12th Legion on the right flank. He saw the assault hit the center and left, saw his fellow legionnaires dying by the hundreds. He saw the panic spreading, men running instead of fighting. He understood immediately. Rome was about to lose. Not might lose. Was losing. Right now. Most men would have run. Survival instinct is powerful, and there's no shame in retreating from 14-to-1 odds when you're caught completely unprepared. History wouldn't judge them for saving themselves. Baculus didn't run. He grabbed his shield and sword, still moving with the muscle memory of 3 decades, and started shouting at the nearest soldiers. Form up. Formation now. Shields together. Stand and fight. Maybe 40 men responded. Everyone else was too panicked or too busy dying. 40 legionnaires against thousands of nervi warriors. Impossible. Baculus didn't care about impossible. He positioned his small group on a slight rise, backs to the camp, shields locked. The testudo formation, the turtle. Shields front, shields overhead, swords ready. It was basic textbook. The first formation every legionnaire learned. It was also the only thing that could save them. The nervi hit them like a wave. Swords crashed against shields, spears punched at gaps. Warriors climbed over their own wounded trying to break the formation. The noise was deafening. Baculus fought in the front rank, which is where centurions always fought. Leading from behind wasn't his style. He stabbed at exposed legs, blocked overhead strikes, used his shield as a weapon when swords got too close. A spear caught him in the shoulder. He broke off the shaft and kept fighting. A sword opened his left arm. He switched his shield grip and kept fighting. An axe glanced off his helmet, leaving him half deaf and bleeding from the ear. He kept fighting. The men around him drew strength from his refusal to break. If the old man could stand, then they could stand. If he wouldn't run, they wouldn't run. Pride, duty, and fear of showing cowardice kept them in formation. They held the right flank. 40 men against thousands. It shouldn't have worked. But Roman training ran deep. Even in chaos, even terrified, the legionnaires remembered their drills. They fought as a unit, covering each other, rotating wounded men to the back, maintaining the shield wall. Baculus knew they couldn't win. Not like this. But if they could hold long enough, If they could buy time for someone to organize a real defense, maybe Rome wouldn't die today. So he stood, and his men stood with him. The left flank was gone. Completely, totally gone. The 7th and 9th legions had been shattered. Men who'd survived the initial assault were being hunted down, killed individually as they tried to flee. The Nervi showed no mercy. This wasn't a battle for prisoners or ransom. This was extermination. Every Roman they found, they killed. Wounded men begging for mercy were stabbed where they lay. Soldiers trying to surrender had their throats cut. The Gauls pushed toward the Roman baggage train, where hundreds of camp followers, slaves, and support personnel watched in horror. They had no weapons, no training, no chance. Some ran for the river and drowned trying to cross. Others hid in wagons and were dragged out and slaughtered. A few fought back with cooking knives and rocks. It didn't help. The 10th Legion, positioned slightly behind the others, tried to form a defensive line. Their legate managed to get maybe 800 men into formation before the Nervi rolled over them. They held for 10 minutes and then broke. Romans were running now, not retreating in good order, not falling back to secondary positions. Running, terrified, disorganized, every man for himself. This was how empires fell. This was how legends ended. Caesar was in the center of the disaster. His personal guards had formed around him, shields locked, protecting their general with their bodies. But they were being pushed back, step by step, toward the river. The proconsul of Rome, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who would one day rule an empire, was about to die in a nameless valley, killed by tribal warriors whose names he didn't know. He could see it happening. His legions destroyed, his officers dead, his soldiers dying. 3 years of victories erased in 30 minutes. Everything he'd built, everything he'd won, collapsing into blood and chaos. Later, in his written account, Caesar would describe this moment with typical understatement. The situation, he wrote, was difficult. That was one way to put it. Complete catastrophe was another. Officers were looking at him, desperate for orders, for some brilliant tactical solution that would save them. Caesar had nothing. There was no clever maneuver here, no strategic genius that could overcome 14-to-1 odds when your men were scattered and dying. But he couldn't just stand there. Leaders don't have the luxury of freezing in crisis. Caesar grabbed a shield from a dead soldier. His own had been lost or dropped somewhere in the chaos. He pushed to the front of his guard formation, shouting at soldiers, trying to rally anyone within earshot. It was almost suicidal. The proconsul of Rome didn't fight on the front line. He commanded from behind, surrounded by protection. But Caesar understood psychology. His men needed to see him fighting, not hiding. If Caesar could stand, maybe they could stand. If their general wouldn't run, maybe they wouldn't run. It was desperate. It was probably futile. But it was something. A Nervi warrior charged at Caesar directly, sword raised. One of the guards intercepted him. Shield checked him off balance, stabbed him through the ribs. The warrior fell, and 2 more took his place. The battle pressed closer. Caesar could smell blood, sweat, and death. He could see the faces of enemy warriors, close enough to make eye contact. This was the moment. Rome would either survive the next few minutes, or Rome would die here, on the banks of an unimportant river, defeated by people they'd considered barbarians. Caesar set his jaw and raised his sword. Fear is complicated. It makes some men run and others fight harder. When retreat is impossible and death seems certain, the human mind does strange things. The Romans at the Sabis River were trapped. The nervi were between them and any escape route. Running meant dying tired. Surrendering meant dying on your knees. So they stopped running. It happened gradually, without orders or planning. Small groups of legionnaires scattered across the battlefield decided they'd rather die fighting than fleeing. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find, formed into loose units, and turned to face the enemy. Training took over. Even in complete chaos, even terrified beyond reason, years of drilling meant something. Roman soldiers knew how to form testudo. They knew how to lock shields, how to create overlapping defensive positions, how to fight as a unit instead of individuals. And they were angry now. Anger replaces fear if you feed it right. These were professional soldiers who'd been ambushed like amateurs. Their friends were dead. Their pride was shattered. The nervi expected them to break completely. Expected the Romans to scatter into the forest, abandon their wounded, beg for mercy. That's what beaten armies did. The Romans formed up and started killing. Small groups became larger groups. A squad of 10 men found another squad and combined. 20 became 50. 50 became 100. Centurions who'd survived started organizing whoever was nearest, regardless of legion or cohort. It wasn't pretty. The formations were ragged, the lines barely held, and men were still dying by the dozens. But momentum started to shift. The nervi were brave. Nobody questioned their courage. But they were fighting individually now, each warrior seeking personal glory, competing for kills. That worked when your enemy was panicked and running. It worked less well against Romans who'd stopped running. A legionnaire in formation, with a shield and short sword, was deadly. The gladius was designed for exactly this kind of fighting. Close quarters, tight spaces, quick stabbing thrusts between shield gaps. Roman soldiers trained for hundreds of hours learning to fight this way. The nervi used longer swords, which needed room to swing. In the press of bodies, in the chaos of melee combat, their weapons became liabilities. Roman discipline started to matter. When a legionnaire in front was wounded, the man behind stepped forward instantly. No gaps, no hesitation, just automatic response. When a nervi warrior was wounded, his entire line became disorganized as friends stopped to help or avenge him. The battlefield tilted. Not dramatically, not obviously. But the Romans stopped losing ground. Small defensive positions held. Counterattacks pushed nervi warriors back meters instead of being overrun. Caesar saw it happening. Saw his broken legions pulling themselves together through pure discipline and refusal to die quietly. It wasn't enough to win. Not yet. But it was enough to not lose. And not losing, when you're supposed to be dead, is its own kind of victory. He kept shouting, kept fighting, kept visible. His guards were down to maybe 30 men, all wounded, all exhausted. But they held. Across the battlefield, Centurion Baculus still held the right flank. His 40 men were now maybe 20. He'd been wounded 4 more times. He was fighting one-handed, his shield arm, nearly useless. He didn't fall. Wouldn't fall, couldn't fall. The Romans were still outnumbered, still trapped, still probably going to die. But they weren't broken anymore. Publius Sextius Baculus was dying. He knew it. Everyone around him knew it. The question was whether he'd die in the next few seconds or the next few minutes. 6 wounds now. A spear through his shoulder. Sword cuts on both arms. An axe had caught his leg, cutting to bone. His ribs were probably broken from a shield bash. His face was covered in blood from a head wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He couldn't feel his left arm anymore. His vision was going gray at the edges. Every breath was agony. He kept fighting. 20 men left in his formation. 20 out of the original 40. The ground around them was covered in bodies, mostly nervy but too many Romans. Blood made the grass slick as ice. The Gauls kept coming. They'd realized this position was holding when everything else was collapsing, so they concentrated their assault. Hundreds of warriors pressing against 20 exhausted soldiers. It should have been over. Would have been over, except Baculus wouldn't let it be over. He couldn't swing a sword anymore. His right arm was too weak, his grip too uncertain. So he used his gladius like a short spear, jabbing from behind the shield wall, letting other men block while he stabbed at any enemy who got close. His men were terrified. You could see it in their eyes. Young soldiers, some in their first real battle, watching their centurion bleed out in front of them and still refusing to run. It changed something in them, made them ashamed to show fear when the old man showed none. Made them angry that after surviving this long, after fighting this hard, they might still die. Made them determined that if they died, they'd die like Baculus. Standing up. A nervy warrior broke through the shield wall. He was huge, covered in blue war paint, screaming. He swung his long sword at Baculus's head. The centurion got his shield up in time, barely. The impact drove him to one knee. His leg, the one with the axe wound, buckled. He was down. The warrior raised his sword for the killing blow. The Legionnaire, next to Baculus, a kid maybe 19 years old from somewhere in southern Italy, stepped forward and drove his gladius up through the warrior's stomach. The Gaul collapsed, and the kid stepped back into formation, shield up, sword ready. Baculus tried to stand. Couldn't. His body had finally given out. Too much blood loss, too much damage. He stayed on one knee, sword still out, shield still up. "You hold," he told his men. His voice was a rasp, barely audible over the battle noise. "You hold this ground, or you die on it. No retreat, no surrender. We're Romans. Act like it." The Legionnaires tightened their formation around him, protecting their centurion even though he was probably dead on his feet. Even though protecting him meant they couldn't protect themselves as well. They held. Other Roman soldiers saw that formation and rallied toward it. If 20 men could hold against hundreds, if a dying centurion could keep fighting, then maybe they all could. Baculus's stand became a rallying point, a lighthouse in the chaos. Men who'd been scattered, who'd been running, who'd given up hope, saw those 20 shields still locked together and found something inside themselves they didn't know was there. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's fighting anyway. It's watching your friends die, feeling your body break, knowing you're probably next, and staying in formation. Baculus had shown them how. Now they'd show the nervy what Romans looked like when they stopped being surprised and started being soldiers. Everything changed when the 10th Legion arrived. Not the same 10th that had been overrun earlier. This was fresh troops, held in reserve miles back, now force marching toward the sound of slaughter. Titus Labienus led them. Caesar's second in command, harder and colder than his general, the kind of officer who won battles through ruthless competence. He'd been securing a river crossing when word reached him that the main force was under attack. He didn't wait for confirmation or detailed orders. He grabbed every available man, left a skeleton garrison, and ran. The 10th Legion covered 3 miles in 20 minutes. Full armor, full weapons, moving at a pace that should have been impossible. They could hear the battle long before they saw it. The screaming, the clash of metal, the sound of thousands of men dying. Labienus crested a hill and saw the disaster below. The Roman camp overrun, bodies everywhere, his legions broken and scattered, the nervy swarming over everything. Any reasonable officer would have stopped. assessed the situation, maybe sent for more reinforcements. Definitely not charged into a battle that was clearly lost. Labienus wasn't reasonable. He formed his men into attack columns and hit the Nervi from behind. 6,000 fresh soldiers crashing into the rear of an army that thought it had already won. The psychological impact was devastating. The Nervi had been fighting for an hour. They were tired, scattered, disorganized from pursuing fleeing Romans across the battlefield. They expected reinforcements to arrive eventually, but not this fast, not this organized. Suddenly, they were the ones being ambushed. Labienus didn't bother with complicated tactics. He just pushed forward, shields locked, swords out. The 10th Legion plowed through Nervi warriors like they were tall grass. The Gauls tried to respond. Some turned to face this new threat. Others kept fighting the enemy in front of them. Their careful ambush became confused chaos. Now the Romans had the Nervi in a vice. Labienus pressing from one side. The survivors of the initial attack rallied around positions like Baculus's stand, pushing from the other. The Legionnaires who'd been dying 15 minutes ago found themselves part of a counterattack. Fresh troops meant hope. Hope meant energy. Energy meant they stopped defending and started killing. Formation discipline reasserted itself. Centuries that had been scattered reformed. Cohorts found their officers. The machine started working again. Caesar saw Labienus's standards and felt something he rarely experienced. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. They weren't dead. Not yet. He rallied the men nearest him, maybe 300 soldiers, and pushed toward the 10th Legion. Other groups did the same. The broken army remembered it was an army. The Nervi were trapped now. Caught between multiple Roman formations, their numerical advantage meant nothing when they were surrounded and disorganized. But they didn't run. That was the thing about the Nervi that shocked every Roman who survived. They didn't retreat, didn't surrender, didn't even try to extract themselves from the deteriorating tactical situation. They just kept fighting, every single one of them, like death was preferable to defeat. In most battles, there's a moment when the losing side realizes they've lost and starts looking for exits. Self-preservation kicks in. You drop your weapon and run, or you surrender, or you fake being dead. The Nervi did none of that. When they couldn't swing swords anymore, they used knives. When knives broke, they used rocks. When they had nothing else, they used their hands. Roman soldiers later described fighting wounded Nervi who should have been dead. Men with fatal injuries still trying to drag Legionnaires down, still trying to kill one more enemy before they died. It was horrifying. It was insane. And it made the Romans respect them even as they cut them down. The Nervi had a code, not written because they didn't write. Just understood. Every warrior knew it from childhood. Dying in battle was glorious. Running from battle was unforgivable. Surrender was worse than death. It was cultural bedrock, the foundation of who they were as a people. While other tribes negotiated with Rome, traded with Rome, tried to coexist, the Nervi built their entire identity around one concept: resistance. They'd seen what happened to tribes that bent the knee. The Romans called it peace, civilization, progress. The Nervi called it slavery. Roman peace meant your land was taxed. Your sons were conscripted into auxiliary legions and sent to die in foreign wars. Your daughters were taken as slaves or concubines. Your culture was slowly erased, replaced with Latin language and Roman law. The Nervi chose death instead. When the battle turned against them, when they realized they were surrounded and outnumbered, a rational people would have retreated, lived to fight another day, preserved their strength for a battle they could actually win. The Nervi weren't interested in rationality. Their chiefs gathered what men they could and formed a final defensive position. They used the bodies of their own dead as walls, stacking corpses shoulder high, creating makeshift fortifications out of flesh and blood. Roman sources describe this with a mixture of horror and admiration. Soldiers attacking those positions had to climb over piles of nervy dead, only to find living warriors waiting on the other side, ready to die just as hard. Some nervy were so wounded they couldn't stand. They fought from sitting positions. Others were blinded by blood, but kept swinging weapons at the sound of approaching footsteps. A few, according to Roman accounts, picked up javelins that had been thrown at them and threw them back, even as they bled out from multiple wounds. This wasn't courage in any normal sense. This was something beyond courage. Fanaticism, maybe. Or maybe just the refusal to give the enemy the satisfaction of seeing them quit. The Romans had never faced anything like it. They'd fought brave enemies before. Germanic tribes were fierce. Spanish guerrillas were tenacious. But everyone, eventually, reached a breaking point where survival instinct overrode honor. Not the nervy. Never the nervy. It made killing them almost sad. Roman soldiers later reported feeling strange about the slaughter. These were warriors fighting to defend their homeland, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. There was something admirable in that, even if it was also insane. But the legions couldn't stop, couldn't show mercy, couldn't let them reform or regroup. So they kept advancing, kept killing, methodically eliminating every pocket of resistance. The nervy chiefs died first. They stood in the front ranks, as leaders should, and were cut down by professional soldiers who'd been killing people for decades. None of them tried to escape. None of them ordered retreat. Their warriors followed that example. If the chiefs wouldn't run, the common soldiers wouldn't run. Pride, duty, and cultural conditioning created a death spiral. By late afternoon, the nervi weren't an army anymore. They were small groups of wounded men making final stands. 20 warriors here, a dozen there, 10 more over by the river. Each group fought until they were all dead. The Romans didn't take prisoners, not because they were cruel, though ancient warfare was always cruel. Because the nervi wouldn't become prisoners. They'd rather die fighting than live defeated. So the legions gave them what they wanted. The sun began to set over a field of bodies. The nervi had come 70,000 strong that morning. By evening, less than 500 remained alive. And those 500 would live with the shame of surviving when their people didn't. The fighting lasted until sunset. Hours of continuous combat, sword work until arms went numb, killing until it stopped meaning anything. By the time it ended, the Sabis River ran red. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's literal description from multiple sources. The river, shallow and clear that morning, was thick with blood by evening. Bodies covered the battlefield in layers. Thousands of them. Nervy mostly. But enough Romans that the survivors walked among dead friends with every step. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, shit, death. The stench of a slaughterhouse multiplied by thousands. Men who'd fought all day vomited when the adrenaline faded and their senses returned. Wounded soldiers made sounds that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Screaming, begging, calling for mothers or gods. Some were Romans. Some were nervy. After a while, the language didn't matter. Pain sounds the same in any tongue. Medics moved through the carnage, trying to help the ones who could be saved. They had to make terrible choices. This man might survive with treatment. That man was too far gone. Limited supplies meant triage, and triage meant deciding who lived and who died. The Romans saved their own first, obviously. But some medics helped wounded nervii too, out of professionalism or pity. Most of those nervii warriors pulled knives and stabbed whoever was trying to help them, then bled out rather than accept Roman mercy. Caesar walked the battlefield that evening. His armor was dented, his cape was torn, and he'd lost his helmet somewhere. He looked at what his ambition had created. 2,000 Romans dead, maybe more. 3 legions nearly destroyed. Officers he'd known for years were corpses now. Soldiers who'd followed him through 3 years of campaigns had died in a valley that didn't even have a name. And the nervii. Caesar counted 70,000 warriors when his scouts reported their numbers. By evening, roughly 500 remained alive. An entire people, an entire culture, nearly exterminated in a single afternoon. The surviving nervii were mostly old men and boys, the ones who'd been too wounded early to keep fighting or too young to reach the front lines. They sat among the dead, shocked, silent, staring at nothing. Roman soldiers guarded them, though there was no need. Where would they run? Everyone they knew was dead. Their villages would be empty. Their tribe was finished. Later, Caesar would write about this battle in his memoirs. He'd describe it as a hard-fought victory against a brave enemy. He'd praise his soldiers' discipline and courage. He'd mention the odds, the ambush, how close Rome came to disaster. But he'd leave out the numbers. Wouldn't mention that he'd nearly gotten his entire army killed through arrogance and bad intelligence. Wouldn't dwell on the thousands of dead Romans whose families would receive letters saying their sons died gloriously for Rome. He definitely wouldn't write about how he stood in a field of corpses that evening and wondered if this was worth it. But some of his officers saw his face, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. This battle, this disaster that became a victory, had cost too much. The conquest of Gaul would continue. Caesar's ambition wouldn't let it stop. But he'd be more careful now. More paranoid, more aware that overconfidence kills just as surely as enemy swords. The Sabis River battle taught Caesar a lesson, not about tactics or strategy, about hubris. And hubris, unchecked, destroys empires. The morning after revealed the full cost. Roman burial details counted bodies while survivors tried to process what they'd lived through. Final casualty figures were devastating. Of the 5,000 Romans who'd started building camp the previous afternoon, roughly 2,000 were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded seriously enough they'd never fight again. Lost limbs, shattered bones, injuries that would kill them slowly through infection. The 7th and 9th legions were effectively destroyed. They'd need to be rebuilt from scratch, reinforced with fresh recruits from Italy, retrained. That would take months, maybe years. The 10th and 12th legions had suffered heavy casualties, but remained combat effective. Barely. Over 60 centurions were dead. These weren't just soldiers. They were the backbone of the legion, experienced professionals who'd spent decades learning their craft. Replacing them would be nearly impossible. Caesar's officer corps was shattered, multiple tribunes dead, senior commanders gone. The command structure that had made his legions so effective was broken. And then there were the nervii. Roman soldiers spent days walking the battlefield, verifying kills, collecting weapons, sorting through the carnage. They counted roughly 65,000 nervii dead. 65,000. An entire people, nearly extinct. Their warriors gone, their leaders dead. Their ability to resist Rome eliminated in a single afternoon of slaughter. The 500 survivors were mostly too old or too young to fight. They'd watched their entire world die. Fathers, brothers, sons, all dead. Their villages would be empty. Their fields would go unplanted. Their culture would fade into nothing. Some historians later questioned whether the nervi numbers were exaggerated. Maybe Caesar inflated enemy casualties to make the victory seem more impressive. Maybe the 70,000 figure was propaganda. But the battlefield evidence supported the numbers. Mass graves dug by the Romans held thousands of bodies. The surviving nervi, when questioned, confirmed their tribe had committed everyone to the ambush. They'd gambled everything on one battle and lost. The psychological impact rippled across Gaul. Other tribes heard what happened at the Sabis River. They heard that the nervi, the fiercest warriors in the region, had ambushed Caesar perfectly, outnumbered him 14-1, and still been destroyed. If the nervi couldn't beat Rome, who could? Some tribes immediately sent envoys offering submission. Better to surrender now, keep your people alive, than resist and be exterminated. Rome accepted these submissions graciously, as if they'd never doubted the outcome. Other tribes grew more desperate. If resistance was futile but submission meant slavery, what choice did that leave? Some decided they'd rather die fighting, like the nervi. Others tried to flee, abandoning their lands and heading deeper into the wilderness. A few started planning their own ambushes, their own desperate last stands. The cycle would continue for years. Caesar's officers urged him to send messages back to Rome immediately. Spin the battle as a great victory, emphasize the odds, praise the soldiers. Make the Senate focus on the triumph, not the near disaster. Caesar agreed. His letter to Rome described the Battle of the Sabis as one of the hardest fights in Roman history. He praised his legion's courage, mentioned the overwhelming enemy numbers, and asked for a celebration and additional troops. He didn't mention that he'd walked into an obvious ambush. Didn't mention that his arrogance nearly got everyone killed. Definitely didn't mention standing in a field of bodies wondering if this was all worth it. Because admitting doubt, admitting mistakes, was weakness. And weakness destroyed careers. So Caesar wrote about glory instead. About Roman superiority and inevitable victory. About divine favor and manifest destiny. And Rome, reading his carefully edited account, believed every word. Publius Sextius Baculus didn't die that day. He should have. Everyone expected him to. But the stubborn bastard refused. Medics found him after the battle, still on one knee in the middle of his defensive position, sword in hand, unconscious from blood loss, but somehow still breathing. 6 wounds. 7, actually. They'd miscounted. A rib had been broken and punctured his lung. That explained the blood he'd been coughing up for the last hour of fighting. He'd fought through a punctured lung. Because of course he had. They carried him to the medical tent on a shield, the way you carried dead officers. He woke up halfway there, tried to stand, collapsed again. The medics tied him down, which probably saved his life, because Baculus absolutely would have tried to return to duty. The injuries were catastrophic. The shoulder wound went all the way through. Bone damage. The leg would need stitches, lots of them. The head wound wouldn't stop bleeding. The broken ribs meant he couldn't breathe properly without screaming. A younger man might not have survived. Baculus was old, tough, and too mean to die. He spent weeks in the medical tent, fevered, delirious, fighting infections that killed tougher men. Medics gave him maybe 1 chance in 10. He beat the odds through sheer stubbornness. Caesar visited him. The proconsul personally thanked a centurion, which almost never happened. He told Baculus that his stand had bought time for the legion to reorganize, that his refusal to break had inspired others to stand. Baculus, half-conscious and high on pain, reportedly told Caesar that he was just doing his job. When he finally recovered enough to walk, Caesar summoned him to headquarters, offered him discharge with full honors and a generous pension. Baculus had earned retirement 10. times over. The centurion refused. He'd been fighting for 35 years. He didn't know how to do anything else. Caesar promoted him instead, made him primus pilus, first spear, the highest-ranking centurion in the legion, gave him command of the first cohort, the most prestigious position a non-noble could hold. Baculus served 9 more years. He fought in Caesar's campaigns across Gaul, then in the civil war against Pompey. He survived battles that killed thousands. Finally died in 48 BC in Egypt, fighting at Caesar's side during the Alexandrian War. He was 62 years old, still a soldier, still refusing to quit. His story became legend in the legions. The centurion who wouldn't die, who held impossible odds through sheer willpower, who inspired an entire army by refusing to accept defeat. Every young soldier heard about Baculus, about how one man's courage in the worst possible moment could change everything, about how discipline and duty mattered more than fear. The Sabis River battle produced many heroes. Officers who reorganized broken units, soldiers who stood when others ran, medics who saved hundreds of lives in impossible conditions. But Baculus was the one everyone remembered. Because his story was simple, pure. He was given an impossible situation and refused to accept it. End of story. That kind of courage is rare. The kind that doesn't calculate odds or worry about survival. The kind that looks at certain death and says, "Not today." Every generation produces a few people like that. People who stand when standing seems pointless, who fight when fighting seems futile, who inspire others just by refusing to break. Baculus was one of them, a 53-year-old centurion with too many scars and not enough sense to quit. He held a position with 40 men against thousands, got wounded 7 times, kept fighting until he physically couldn't stand. And because he wouldn't break, his legion didn't break. Because his legion didn't break, Rome didn't fall. One man, one decision. Everything changed. Military historians still study the Battle of the Sabis River. Not as Caesar presented it, a glorious victory against impossible odds, but as a case study in how battles are actually won and lost. The initial Roman failure was textbook. Caesar made multiple critical mistakes. He split his forces. He advanced without proper reconnaissance. He allowed his men to construct camp in an exposed position without securing the perimeter. He underestimated his enemy completely. Any one of those mistakes could be forgiven. All of them together should have been fatal. The Nervi ambush was perfectly executed. They achieved complete tactical surprise. They attacked at the worst possible moment for the Romans, when soldiers were scattered, exhausted, and unprepared. They committed overwhelming force to critical points. By every military principle, the Nervi should have won. They'd done everything right. So why didn't they? The answer reveals something fundamental about warfare. Tactics matter, numbers matter, surprise matters, but they're not determinative. What determines battles is how soldiers respond when everything goes wrong. Roman training created automatic responses. Even panicked, even terrified, Legionnaires knew how to form testudo. They drilled it thousands of times. Their bodies moved before their minds caught up. That muscle memory bought seconds. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became organized resistance. The Roman command structure also mattered. When senior officers died, centurions took over. When centurions died, junior officers stepped up. There was always someone giving orders, someone maintaining structure. The Nervi had brave warriors and competent chiefs. But when their leaders fell, individual fighters made individual decisions. No central coordination, no fallback plans. Roman discipline versus Gallic courage. In a long battle, discipline usually wins. But there's another factor historians emphasize: leadership. Specifically, personal leadership. Caesar and Baculus both led from the front. They didn't direct the battle from safe positions. They grabbed shields and fought beside common soldiers. That matters more than people realize. Soldiers fight harder when their leaders share the danger. When a general picks up a sword and stands in the shield wall, it changes the psychological dynamic. Caesar wasn't a great swordsman. He probably didn't kill many enemies personally. But his presence, his refusal to retreat while asking his men to stand, inspired them. Same with Baculus. His personal courage became a force multiplier. Men fought harder because they didn't want to let him down. There's also the reserve force factor. Labienus, arriving with the 10th Legion, turned the battle. But why was there a reserve? Because Roman doctrine always held back fresh troops, always planned for contingencies. The Nervi committed everything to the initial assault. When that didn't achieve total victory, they had nothing left. No fresh troops, no reserves, no second wave. All-or-nothing tactics sometimes work. But when they don't, you lose everything. The combination of factors saved Rome. Training that created automatic responses. Command structure that survived decapitation. Personal leadership that inspired desperate men. Reserves that arrived at the critical moment. And soldiers who decided dying fighting was preferable to dying running. The Nervi were brave. They fought brilliantly initially. But bravery alone doesn't win battles. Preparation wins battles. Discipline wins battles. Having a backup plan wins battles. The Romans had all three. The Nervi had courage and good tactics. In ancient warfare, that usually wasn't enough. The Battle of the Sabis River became required study at Roman military academies. Future generals learned what not to do from Caesar's mistakes. They also learned what to do when disaster strikes. Stay calm, reorganize quickly, lead from the front, trust your training. Those lessons remained relevant for centuries. They're still relevant today.